Can I have your attention, please? Hello, everybody. I'm not going to say good morning because it's no morning anymore. Anyway, I think it's a great honor, a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's not to the date, but close. 29 years ago, I was on a boat called Georg Ots. That was the only boat that was sailing between Helsinki and Tallinn. My home is only 80 kilometers north from here. I started my career in broadcasting working for a private commercial radio station, Radio 1, and me and a bunch of my colleagues were on that boat in order to organize a rock concert in Tallinn with our Estonian friends called Rocksummer. Some of you locals might remember that. It was a fantastic 3-day festival, and it started something that now is called the singing revolution, as I think you Estonians call it as well. Pretty amazing. Now, that was 1988, and this is 2017, and since then, Estonia declared or re-declared its independence, has joined NATO for security reasons, has joined EU for other reasons, not the least the financial, the economic reasons, but also to belong to a family. Similar values, democracy, Western democracy, and so forth. It's pretty amazing that I'm here moderating a discussion about the financial crisis and what the economic cooperation, integration means for Europe. I closely followed the horrible years between 2008 and 2012 from Brussels, and I remember those sleepless nights on the council floor, not knowing what would happen, and usually, well, it became a joke between some of us journalists that Mondays were the horrible ones because there was always this race against the markets, and we always knew that something would come up and then we would have to work yet another sleepless night. We've come far from that. A lot has been done. There is a lot to be done, and I think I have an excellent group of experts in their own fields here in front of you. We start with Martin Sandbu from Financial Times, has written books and several articles about the EU crisis, well, Euro crisis, but also the finances in Europe. And then we have Rainer Kattel, a visiting professor from, sorry, I have to check this, University College of London, and as I read through your articles, I found this one red thread that you focus a lot on how we sell economic policies to the people, or if we... Sorry.
Sure.
That wasn't you. No, as I read through your articles, it reminded me of Finland's policies that digital world is something new that we should look into, and we should make the best of it, harness it for wealth. And I hope you say something about that. And then we have Guntram Wolff, director of Bruegel, a very distinguished think tank, economic think tank in Brussels, and you, of course, have worked with several former and sitting finance ministers and experts, and been asked advice of, and well, advise us. How should we reform Euro area in order to fight coming crises, and how should what we have learned not to do from the past. And then, last but least, welcome also George Pagoulatos, professor of European politics and economy from Athens. You worked as a counselor, as an advisor for 2 interim governments during the hard years in Greece, 2011 to 2012, and it will be really interesting to hear your thoughts of what was wrong, what went wrong, and what we have learned. As we all know that by the end of 2015, everybody was talking about Greece as a separate crisis instead of connecting it directly to financial crisis and euro crisis. If we start with you, Guntram, you have your 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference. So the question we got is the economy still holding Europe together? And when I thought about this question, I thought it's basically an impossible question to answer, but I think what is very clear that dismantling the current levels of integration that we have, economic integration, would certainly cause a lot of damage. And in that sense, I think the incentive is very strong to stay together, because dismantling would be very costly. But let me still emphasize that, also relating to the previous panel, that I think it is a political question whether we are holding together or not. And that very much depends on the kind of parties and so on we will get in the respective governments across Europe. And it seems to me that for these elections that we have been discussing, these identity concerns that Piotr was mentioning, identity community concerns, may actually be significantly more important than the economic factors that we tend to look at. So I would very much emphasize that this question of identity is very much at the heart of the discussion of who we are, who we want to be, and how much do we want to go further with integration. I will come back to that in a minute. But if we look at the economic side, I think it's fair to say that the economy is doing really well at the moment. So I think Mr. Juncker talked of tailwinds, but let me give you some statistics to start off with. So we've been in now a recovery in which economic growth has been above potential growth for 16 quarters, so that's 4 years. And if we look at what that means in terms of employment numbers, so we compare 2013 to 2017, we will see that if you look at employment in the European Union, we've been at 224 million in 2013, and we are now at 234 million. So there's almost a 10 million increase in employment in the last 4 years. Similarly, in the Eurozone, we went up from 149 to 155, so that's 6 million more jobs in the Eurozone. So I think in terms of employment, actually quite a significant recovery. In terms of growth, quite a significant recovery in the last 4 years. Yet, let me emphasize that this is not everywhere the same. And I also looked up some statistics for you for that. If you look at the unemployment statistics, they have come down in the Eurozone from 12 to 9, in the EU from 10.9 to 8. So we have a decrease in unemployment levels in the area as a whole. But if you take individual countries, the performance is quite mixed. So let's start with Spain, which had a massive improvement. So 27.5% in 2013. Now we are at 17%. So this is a very significant reduction, but we are still at 17% unemployment. Yeah, I mean, so 17 is not a small number. But then there are countries where the improvement has been really quite minimal, and that includes Italy and France, where unemployment numbers really stay quite high and the improvement is almost not visible. And Germany, of course, is a country that's doing extremely well with unemployment now at around 4%. Poland also, since we are in Central Eastern Europe, Poland, massive improvement, situation really looks much better in unemployment. But also if you take a country like the Czech Republic, major improvements in unemployment numbers. So I would say overall there has been quite a bit of improvement, But let's face it, there's a number of countries where unemployment numbers still are very high, and that, of course, is also a source of discontent among citizens and popular uprising. And I would warn against prematurely thinking that sort of the economic issues are over and therefore we can lay back. And I would also warn against thinking that the victory by Emmanuel Macron means that we are now out of the woods in France or in other countries. Political pressures arising from unemployment, from the feeling of not having job opportunities, not having an opportunity to belong to economy, to the society, remain very significant in a number of countries. Now that brings me to my third point, which is what do we need to do to sort of sort out some of the remaining problems. And I think one of the most important issues is adjusting the divergences in the Eurozone, which are very significant and which have been manifesting themselves in, for example, the current accounts. We've seen before the crisis massive current account deficits in the south and massive current account surpluses in the north of Europe. The current account deficits in the south have disappeared. Yet in the north, including in my home country, they have actually increased. And so German current account surplus clearly is a sign of major imbalances in the Eurozone. And I think they correlate with the imbalances that we see in the labor markets, namely Italy, Spain still very high unemployment rates, Germany very low unemployment rates. So I think working on this adjustment between especially the big countries, because the small countries basically have done their job. So Portugal has done its job, Ireland has done its job, Greece, if you look at cost numbers, unit labor cost numbers, has done its adjustment. Spain has done the adjustment, but Italy, Germany and France are still subject to very significant divergences in unit labor cost and therefore also in employment numbers and in current account numbers. Now, this adjustment agenda was asymmetric when we talked about small countries, because when Ireland has an adjustment problem, it's not plausible to ask Germany to do an adjustment because Ireland is so small, so Ireland basically adjusted to the rest of the Eurozone. But now we are talking about three big countries, namely Italy, France and Germany, and that is actually a very complicated discussion, because to think that this adjustment can happen only in Italy and in France, I think would be short-sighted, and it will not work politically, and it will trigger major backlash politically. And there I would put quite some emphasis on the symmetry adjustment. So we need symmetric adjustment. Now, the good news here is that I think a Jamaica coalition in Germany could actually trigger quite a bit of adjustment in Germany by opening up, liberalizing, doing investment and reforms that have not happened in the last 4 or 5 years, including in the digital markets and services sector, in public broadband investments, public infrastructure investment. I think we could see actually quite a bit more action with the Jamaica coalition than we have seen in the last 4 years in the Grand Coalition, where basically nothing was done and nothing happened except for the minimum wage. Now, my last point will be what about the Eurozone architecture agenda, which is a big agenda, and where I think you asked me, whether Germany in the end will be ready to pay. I think that's the way you asked me, and I think there my view is that. Sort of the ideal monetary union construction that I think we would like to see on paper from the point of a monetary union would be one where we have a clear allocation of certain functions at the federal level and a clear allocation of other functions at the national level. And that means some functions will have to shift from the national to the federal level. including the issue of Eurozone macroeconomic stabilization policy. I think this is an ideal that does not correspond to what people actually want, so citizens' preferences. I think it very much would oppose this original point I made, that people want to have a sense of identity and community. And I think this, sort of to think that we can now create a Eurozone level social welfare system so that we can better manage our macroeconomic stabilization function, I think would totally backfire and will not be appreciated in the large majority of Eurozone countries, because it would mean giving up long-held preferences for how we want to run our welfare systems. If you look at the welfare system in Germany, it goes back to Bismarck. The French one is even older, and so on. And thinking that we would shift these things to the federal level to get some tiny improvements in macro stabilization, I think would be completely wrong and would not be useful at this stage. Now, that means we need some realism in this reform agenda, and I think the realism that I see that where some space for improvement is possible, and where probably we will get eventually the political support, is about this whole agenda of increasing the financial stability of the Eurozone, which is very much an agenda around banking union, so finishing the banking union. Very controversial still, but I think it's an agenda where intellectually many people will agree. And if you read the so-called non-paper that, for example, the conservative German finance ministry published yesterday, there is an implicit acknowledgement that we need to finish the job there. And so I think this agenda will continue. Also, the agenda of transforming the ESM into an EMF, I think, will continue. But I think essentially the nature of the monetary union as one where the ultimate decision-making on fiscal policy, on 48% of government spending, 48% of GDP, that's our government spending roughly, will remain at the national level. And to think we can move that to the federal level, I think would be to ignore the political desires of the large majority of our member states. Thank you.
Thank you. If I heard you correctly, better functioning monetary union is possible, even desirable, without fiscal union.
Well, without a fiscal union, so if you finish banking union, there's fiscal elements to it. So this is also a fiscal agenda, but it's a more narrow one.
But not too much. Then we go to you, Martin, because Guntram also talked about the sense of identity community, which is something that you're going to talk about as well.
I think the question to the whole panel is very well posed. Does the economy still hold Europe together? So I'd like to answer your question sort of through the prism of the big question. And I want to start with a very short anecdote. Before this summer, I was in a taxi in London, and as all journalists know, taxis are where you get the real wisdom. And this was a taxi driver with an Essex accent, this sort of stereotypical white English taxi driver, and we just small talked about what are you doing this summer and so on. He said, I'm going to visit my parents in Italy. I said, so they moved there then? So no, they're Italian. They came here and now they moved back. So I sort of very cautiously asked, so what do you make of this whole Brexit thing then? They said, well, to tell you the truth, I voted leave, too much immigration, the country's full. But if I'd known then what I know now, I probably would have voted Remain. And what he meant was, it turns out to be really complicated to extricate yourself. That's a process. That was one very little straw in the wind. But it's a process that Britain is going through at the moment, right? Sort of realizing how tight these economic bonds are and how costly it actually is to give them up. That is a sign of how the economy is indeed keeping Europe together, if only insofar as it's making more British people realize how much they've been benefiting and how much they will lose from pulling out. We can talk about Greece too. I mean, Greece was the closest to an exit from the euro in this case, and who knows what would have followed from that. But even with the traumatic experience they've had in the crisis, there's a huge majority of Greeks who want to stay in the euro. The 2015 referendum was not about leaving the euro, it was a sort of scream to try to do things differently within the euro. And in fact, in every Eurozone country, there are majorities in support of the euro. So, the supposed difficulties haven't actually made people on the whole want to pull out. And there's sort of a very old idea in this. Montesquieu, who 250 years ago wrote about the separation of powers, also wrote about this idea of doux commerce, gentle commerce. People who trade together, do commerce together, tend to be at peace with one another. Why is that? Because when you do things, when your economy is integrated, your interests align. And that's still the big truth here. So we have to remember that big truth when we talk about both the bad experience Europe and especially the Eurozone went through after the crisis, and when we talk about the various technical proposals on the table for perfecting EMU and so on. The big truth is that having a common economy aligns your interest, and the European model of integrating the economy is particularly well suited for aligning those interests, because prosperity today, more than earlier, depends on rules that govern a very complex productive system. It depends on international supply chains that need smooth cross-border transfers. It depends on all the things that the EU is particularly good at. So I want to frame all this in a very positive way, that actually the model has been working a lot better than we give it credit for, and is well placed to continue to do that in the way modern economic activity works. Now, there's another element of how the economy binds people together. It's that when there is growth, people tend to be happy. Very simple. When there wasn't growth, and when there isn't growth, of course you get more antagonism, because things become a zero-sum game. There's less to go around. It's a very obvious point, right? But it just explains why it's important to have policies that keep the economy growing. And this is something Europe, and in particular the Eurozone, did very poorly after the crisis. Guntram has pointed out all the good news since 2013. And we can add to that if we compare the EU and the Eurozone since 2013, its recovery has been just as strong as the US recovery since 2009. The first 4 years of the US recovery look identical in terms of the numbers to the Eurozone recovery since 2013. But it was 4 lost years, right? Second recession. I have a non-mainstream view on this. I think it had not so much to do with supposed design flaws in the euro, and a lot to do with just really poor policy choices that there were alternatives to. There was a choice to tighten fiscal policy, there was a choice to tighten monetary policy at the same time, and there was a choice to, instead of cleaning up banking systems and getting rid of debt overhangs through restructuring, to extend and pretend and bail out and not remove any of these unresolved losses. So that continued to weigh on economic activity. So there were avoidable mistakes, unforced errors that caused a lot of damage. But once you stopped making those mistakes, 2013, 14, 15, lo and behold, things recovered. And they're going reasonably well, but there's a lot of road to catch up. But in that process, you've seen support for the EU go up, you've seen support for the euro go up, pretty much across the board. So that's, again, a positive story. Now, that doesn't mean all is well. And I think we need to keep in mind that there are several long-term economic difficulties going on here. So there's a long-term structural change, not just in Europe, but in every advanced economy, which involves deindustrialization. And this has been going on for 30, 40 years. Nothing to do with the last crisis, nothing to do with the euro. But every industrial economy has seen a gradual loss of jobs in industry. That has effects on a certain group of people, in particular the unskilled male working class, and particular places, namely the geographical places where those industries were concentrated, within countries and within larger regions. That's a very long process. And I think we should note how long it took for that to become politically salient. So these things have very kind of long, slow-working political effects. And it only really happened after another big economic shock, which was the global financial crisis, which led to a downturn across the globe and this particularly bad experience in Europe. But everywhere, a lack of growth, economies producing 15% less than they were expected to before the crisis, still today, and that means less money to go around. So a whole other group of people have lost out, and especially the young, and especially in countries where there's not enough housing and you can't buy a house and so on. So you had a long, slow burn for the old industrial class. You had an extreme shock that affects a much larger portion. Put the two together, and you have near a majority, perhaps, of people who've really suffered economically or got a bad deal and have all right to be angry. But let's keep in mind that there are several stories happening at the same time, and when they came on top of one another, that's when we got this insurgency against the international liberal economic order. Now, what does that mean in terms of what to do? That's the kind of the counterpoint to my overall optimistic story. These are the things, these are the economic forces that are tearing people apart. And not just European countries apart, but populations within European countries apart. Everything we've talked about really in this conference are kind of the international unity of processes that happen within each country. Increased inequality, increased political polarization, and you see this pretty much everywhere to a greater or lesser degree. But it's not just a European system story, it's something happening within each country, including non-European countries. What do we do about it? Well, in terms of the cyclical economic shock that happened with the global financial crisis, well, you try to make economies, you try to come back in the economic cycle, have a cyclical upturn, and come back to full capacity, full employment. That is happening. It happened far too late in Europe, but it's happening. But that involves pretty traditional tools. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, cleaning out debt overhangs. That is sort of the easy bit. That still leaves partly ongoing legacies of those who suffered the most in the crisis, but in particular this very long, slow burn dealing with, having to do with deindustrialization. And that's not going to go away just because we get a cyclical recovery. It can help. A cyclical recovery makes it a lot easier to try to bring some people who've fallen out of the labor market or onto the fringes back into jobs. But there is a remaining big problem that is not going to go away. Now, it's not impossible to deal with those, and we know that because despite all the talk of how the international system removes power for national policymakers, different countries have actually had very different levels of success in addressing these big structural changes. Many countries have done poorly, but some countries have done pretty well. So I have in mind Canada, the Scandinavians, Japan, and as a result have more manageable politics too in this regard. What is it that these countries have done? Well, in some cases it's retaining some of the good parts of the old social democratic model, retaining some form of representation through union coverage, economic representation, but also an ability for the political system to give a voice to those who have lost out through structural economic change, so that they're not left behind in the sense that they have no voice. Remember that if you look at it in the long-term perspective, the people who lost out from deindustrialization got marginalized and sort of fell out of politics before they came back when they were offered false solutions by populist movements. But part of the story is that for a while they had no one they thought represented their interest. So that's one lesson, right? You need representation, both economically and politically. But you also need economic policies to reincorporate, sort of give a space in the economy to those who have been left behind. And unfortunately, a lot of the policies we've pursued, and that are still a bit part of the consensus, haven't been and aren't very helpful in that regard. In particular, I'm worried, and I heard some of this language in Guntram's comments, about wage competitiveness. Wage competitiveness means to try to bring wages down, right? That's what it means, or keep them low. That's not a very attractive offer to people who are economically marginalized. And I also think it doesn't always make economic sense. If you look at the most successful countries, some of the Scandinavian countries, for example, one way they've succeeded, traditionally and still today, is that by keeping wages high at the bottom end of the distribution, they've increased productivity, they've encouraged capital accumulation, they've increased structural shifts into more productive ways of doing industry or more productive sectors altogether. So I think more and more we understand that it's not true that there is this trade-off between good work conditions and productivity. Very often it's the other way around, that kind of protecting the bottom actually makes for a more productive economy over time.
I'm going to stop you there. Once you let lecture loose, he'll never stop. We come back to you, but now we go back. Now we go to George and Greece. Case Greece. Martin was talking about avoidable damage, you know, and now maybe we're looking for representation and economic support. During the crisis years, the big thing was in Finland, in Germany, in Holland, you know, oh, do we have to pay for that? So it was austerity versus support, solidarity, if you wish. I'm very interested in hearing your words, how you would go forward, keeping in mind what Guntram has said and also Martin.
Thank you. Well, I have the unenviable privilege of being both a scholar of the Eurozone political economy and a Greek, which over the last 7 years has felt a bit like observing the zoo from inside the monkey's cage. What I would like to say to begin with is that Greece has done Europe a great disservice. And I do not mean the obvious in terms of Greece failing in a completely predictable way. Greece was the textbook failure predicted under any orthodox textbook of the EMU, that a country fails through its fiscal imbalances and through its fiscal recklessness. And indeed, Greece was exactly the case of that. The Greek crisis was our own doing, but the Eurozone crisis was not the result of the Greek crisis. If we look at the features of the countries that ended up being bailed out, it was not the budgetary imbalances that led to the crisis. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had Ireland and Spain, which were countries with paradigmatic budgetary discipline. We would have had Greece and Italy, but Italy stayed out did not need to be bailed out, despite its ongoing problems. And that was because the crucial element was the external imbalances, the current account imbalances. What all these 4 countries had in common, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, was that they ended up in the crisis with large current account deficits. And the crisis, as we now know, was a case of what is being called the sudden stop, capital coming in, financing the expansion of deficits, both in the budget, in the public sector, in the case of Greece, and Portugal in the private sector, in the case of Ireland, Spain, and Portugal as well, suddenly stopped to flow in. And this massive sort of outflow of capital had to be covered through a bailout mechanism, through resort official funding, which were the bailouts. And I say that because it is important, because Greece failed, did a disservice to the Eurozone by failing first and by allowing this false narrative to be built that it was all a matter of lack of fiscal discipline, and if you take care of fiscal discipline, you have solved the problem. In fact, external imbalances, as I said, were the principal driver, and external imbalances of the crisis and external imbalances have not been purely dealt with, because we have had a kind of adjustment that has been highly asymmetric. The countries of the periphery that ended up in crisis have corrected their current account deficits, and they've done so through a mix of very painful internal devaluation and a rise in exports. Some of them have been more successful in that, Spain and Portugal, Ireland as well. Greece has been probably less successful, but it has also covered the gap, and all of them now have current account deficits that are practically in balance. Whereas the adjustment that should have been done on the surplus side by the economies that were running large current account surpluses was not done. And we now have a rule under the macroeconomic imbalance procedure in the Eurozone that deficits should not exceed 4% and surpluses should not exceed 6%, but we have economies that are running current account surpluses far above that. And there has been an argument, it's been argued very convincingly by Martin Sandbu that it is not the size of the current account surplus that matters, but it is the change in it. But I would tend to counter-argue that a very large current account surplus exercises a potentially deflationary effect in terms of the adjustment of the rest. At least, if you like, by depriving the rest of the Eurozone of the stimulus that it would have had through the reduction of this large current account surplus. And the problem was that the only mechanism that we have had, that we've seen over the last few years for adjustment, has largely been the mechanism of internal devaluation, deflation. Now, I'm not arguing that this should not be a part of the recipe. I'm just saying that if you rely exclusively on that, you might at some point hit the wall. And the wall is not only economic, in terms of it being bad economics, and I'll explain why, but it might also be the social politics of it. That if, at the end of the day, you've ended up with a reduction in wages that has reached 20%, 25%, and we've seen reductions, even nominal wage cuts. We used to believe that wages are sticky. You cannot cut them nominally because they only, you only allow inflation to do the job. This might indeed gain some price competitiveness in terms of wages, but it comes at a huge cost. And the huge cost is the rise of populists, is the challenges that have to do with democracy itself. Now, what I'm saying is that having established that this crisis was a Eurozone level crisis and not purely a matter of national budgetary, lack of national budgetary discipline, we should have had a much more extensive reliance on Eurozone level responses to the crisis. Now, we have had Eurozone level responses to the crisis. We've had very impressive institutions and policies being built. The bailouts were an important step forward. The ECB has launched an unprecedented program of unorthodox activism to confront the crisis. But the Eurozone cannot rely on the ECB as a lender of last resort for the sovereigns and cannot rely on the ECB to stimulate growth. And Martin rightfully said that when the flawed policies of recessionary fiscal consolidation and policies of internal devaluation exercised by all at the same time were replaced by a more accommodative fiscal stance or a more balanced fiscal policy on the Eurozone level, it made a huge difference. But when a crisis is a crisis of the Eurozone or failed Eurozone policies, you cannot resolve it only by resorting to internal devaluation and painful deflation on the side of the deficit countries. This is what I'm saying. And what we now know is that there is a list of policies that can be adopted by the Eurozone in order to allow for this more coordinated and more effective response to crisis. Because my argument is not that the greatest burden of adjustment shouldn't have been borne by the deficit economies. Greece and Portugal and all the rest needed massive adjustment, both in terms of price levels and more particularly in terms of reforms. My argument is that while these economies are implementing painful reforms, you should have a set of supportive policies at the Eurozone that should assist them in this reform effort, so that the sacrifice and the pain does not go to waste. And my point here is that we did not have these supportive policies to a sufficient degree. And we certainly did not have them up to 2013. And just to give you another example of that, I would argue that the policy mix needs to be balanced. In other words, look at the countries in the Eurozone periphery. They had a very restrictive fiscal policy. Fiscal consolidation was extremely front-loaded and sharp and painful. In the Greek case, it amounted to an adjustment of the primary balance of about 14 percentage points between 2009 and 2015. Fiscal policy was extremely recessionary. Incomes policy was highly recessionary as well. Nominal wages were cut across the board. And there, you would expect monetary policy to be accommodative in order to allow the economy some oxygen, to allow it to breathe. And the monetary policy by the ECB was indeed expansionary from the beginning. But the problem was that the monetary transmission mechanism was broken, that the low interest rates that resulted from the lax monetary policy of the ECB never actually reached the periphery. And the companies, the small, medium-sized companies, even the most competitive ones, those that had done all the homework, had done all their adjustment, had markets, had clients, were very productive, had to suffer capital costs that were much higher than their competitors in Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, and so forth. So small and medium countries in Portugal, in Greece, in Spain, in Italy to a certain extent, were paying a premium, which was the sort of the country risk or the currency redenomination risk for some of them, or the default risk that affected the private sector. And this was the result of financial fragmentation in the Eurozone, and this was the result of a lack of sufficient Eurozone level response to the crisis. And what this meant was that all the pain that was involved in achieving wage adjustment through deflation, the adjustment that was achieved through wage deflation was swallowed by high and prohibitive capital costs for companies. So this is not a smart way of managing a crisis. And that is why the package that has been put forward by the Commission and proposals that have been made by governments such as that of France or that of Italy are on the right track. Now, I share the skepticism of Guntram Wolff that we cannot go very far in terms of adjustment, in terms of fiscal capacity, in terms of fiscal union. I would not hold my breath that we're going to have much of that anytime soon. But at least we need to go faster on the road of financial integration, on the road of building a real banking union, on the road of reducing the kind of impact of bank-based financial systems and resorting to alternative sources of finance, allowing companies that cannot access effectively bank credit in their countries to be able to do so through a more pan-European banking system, and allow them also to access capital by angel investors, by private equity, by venture capital, and so forth, which is part of the Capital Markets Union project. We need some sort of backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. I was glad to read it in the non-paper of the German Finance Ministry yesterday, even though it said that it required revision of the ESM treaty. We need a kind of fiscal backstop on the third pillar of banking union, which is a joint deposit insurance system, because depositors in the periphery need to be sure that at least the secured part of their deposits is safe, and its safety does not depend on the creditworthiness of their national government. All these things are needed, they're necessary, they're not sufficient. I insist that they're not sufficient, but at least we should move along this path in implementing those steps. Now, the other thing I would like to say is that the Eurozone came close to missing the opportunity of a crisis. It should not miss the opportunity of a recovery. A recovery is a terrible thing to miss. And now there is a window of opportunity because the Eurozone is indeed growing. The Eurozone is in its fastest cyclical recovery since 2008. And good times are the right times to implement reform, because that's the time people feel confident about the future. That's the time that when governments can undertake the political cost of making compromises. And that is also the time when losers can be compensated. And one of the greatest failures in the Eurozone crisis, and especially coming from Greece and the Greek crisis, was that Greece was forced to adjust during recession as a result of not having adjusted while having the highest growth rate among almost all Eurozone countries up to 2007. Growth is the best time to implement reforms. National reforms must be the main focus, and I agree with the logic that says that national responsibility is a precondition for European solidarity. But as long as national responsibility is shown through national level adjustment, and I think it has been agreed that the adjustment that has been done by the peripherals, including Greece, has been extraordinary, taking into account their starting level. These reforms have to be assisted by conducive and appropriate policy initiatives at the European level. We need to focus, and let me finish with that. Adjustment is not just cutting wages. Adjustment is raising the levels of productivity. Adjustment is taking advantage of a unique opportunity of near zero interest rates to invest in the skills and the training and the infrastructures of tomorrow. And we haven't seen that to a sufficient degree, and we haven't seen that targeted towards the economy that have suffered a huge cost from implementing very painful internal adjustment. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Now, last but not least, Rainer, as I at the beginning mentioned, that I have this memory of crossing the waters 1988 to Soviet Tallinn. Now, I can't stop smiling looking at Estonia at the moment, how far and how fast it's come. In many ways, it's more modern than Finland, partly because of technology, the use of new technology and innovations and digital economy, and I hope you talk about that, how we can, as George was talking about, let's not miss the recovery. Maybe new tools can help us with that.
Yeah, right. I think, first of all, I find it very interesting that over the last 2 days we talk about European Union, sort of try to say, it's quite good, it's quite okay, don't worry, it's still there, it's fine. So we sort of have to remind ourselves that it's not falling apart yet. And I think it is something about European Union that it's really fundamentally about stability and really trying to keep things from actually happening, sort of worse things happening. And of course you can argue, well, this is in the DNA of European Union because we were very good at land wars, and we wanted to make sure that we don't have any more massive land wars in Europe, and then we created European Union. And of course, but this has become really the DNA of European sort of a collective action as well. Let's not do anything really too radical. And I think the current crisis or current recovery the problem is not really that we have not enough stability so that nobody invests and all that, but exactly we have a problem of dynamism. We have actually a problem of investment. And I think this is really sort of, as I said, in the DNA of European institutions. And the way we even talk about European Union is that, yes, now we have stability and all that. So I think we really need to start rethinking the European Union as some sort of an active form of collective action. And I think this is really fundamentally also for everybody on this panel or everybody in this room to actually rethink European Union, that somehow is actually a dynamic actor on the world level as well, because this is a market of 500 million people, so it's not a peanuts in the global scale. So we can do stuff, and historically, of course, we have done a lot of stuff. And of course also, it's not a problem that we don't have money. EU has, if anything, too much money. The problem is, where does the money go? And I think now the money goes more into speculation than actually productive investment, and this is something I will come back to. If you look at, yes, European Union is very much a political union, so it's a political marriage of necessity and all that. But of course, people on the street really don't care about that. They experience European Union as very much an economic union. And in that sense, as we have heard before in this panel, many people actually have lost out. So as you said, the youth unemployment, especially in the Southern Europe, is massively high. And it's not like it's 2016, you had 40% youth unemployment in Greece or in Spain. So it has been so for 10 years. So it's an entire generation that has been basically out of jobs. So what do you expect will happen in 20 or 10 years if these people are getting older, and how are they going to vote? And all that. So I think this is a much larger problem that in many ways the European Union has failed to deliver on an economic level. And even if you look at the recovery or over the past few years, if you take GDP per capita, Southern European countries are still falling behind EU 28. So it's not Eurozone, but EU 28. That includes Romania, Bulgaria, all of those countries that are not known for being wealthy. Right, so, but even then, Spain, Greece are still falling behind. So we're still having a huge problem in the southern periphery. And as we know, as you said, it's also within these even wealthy countries, or countries that do relatively well, like Estonia. But Estonia has one of the highest Gini indexes in Europe. So obviously there is something going on with this model as well. So I think the European Union, while it is stable enough, it's still there, it's all fine, we don't have any more wars, that's all right, but also it actually fails to deliver on the economic side, I would argue. And there are basically key sort of institutional dysfunctions. As I said, yes, the European Union is massively investing in R&D. So it's one of the largest global programs in R&D is Horizon 2020. So it's 76 billion euros over 7 years. But of course, then you go over to Frankfurt and look at what European Central Bank is doing. European Central Bank has been buying assets on the market since 2 years, every month, around for 70 billion euros. So on the one hand, we are really proud that we spend 70 billion for R&D over 7 years. And on the other hand, there are a bunch of people who are pushing money into the market in the same amount for every month for 2 years. So that is the question. That's what I mean. There's not that there is not enough money, but where does the money go? So we have really, European Union, what is really weak is sort of finding the institutional ways for money to go for productive investments. Be it infrastructure, be it skills, all of these things. So there's a lot of money, but we just know what to do with it because we are so scared that maybe we lose the stability that is our core value. And I think sort of we are erring too much on the side of stability. And the other thing, I think you mentioned it, or everybody's sort of mentioning it, that Germany, yes, exports way more than its imports. And it's just not way more, it's like historically more. I mean, it's mind-bogglingly much. And we sit there and say, well, we can't do anything other than let's somehow adjust. But of course, even European countries, even European Union in the 1950s, we had a clearinghouse system. So if you exported too much, you had to buy from the countries you export to. So, and now we just sit there, wow, we can't do anything. I mean, so obviously we had the sort of the innovations, if you will, the institutional innovations, in the past. We knew what to do with them. And now we think that we can't do anything because stability is so much more important than anything else. And I think the stability is on the cost of these people who are unemployed for 10 years and whatnot. So I think these dysfunctions are really fundamental. And I think what we come back to then and say, yes, we can't have like European-wide social welfare state. Of course not, but who wants that? I mean, nobody really wants that. I mean, we want to have welfare state that is basically, the current version of the welfare state was invented before the black and white TV. You know, most people even don't have TVs here anymore because we are using devices. And so why should we talk about the welfare state in a sense that it was invented by Bismarck? But we need different kinds of insurance schemes. We need to insure for people who are in the gig economy, in the sharing economy, all of these economies. And instead of that, we talk about, well, we can't have the welfare state of Bismarck, of course, but nobody wants that either. And I think this is the drive that EU has lost. And of course, this is where the digital comes into play and say, yes, we can do digital union. And we had last week, we had the digital summit here, and I think it has all the wonderful right things. But I think also in the digital arena, we focus too much on saving, efficiency. Also, if I think Estonia, which is the digital leader in many ways in Europe, if you look how Estonia advertises itself, we save 2% of GDP by having digital signatures. But is that really the most important message to tell to a person on the street? You have saved 2% GDP. You know, who cares? 2% of GDP. I, as a person, have nothing to do with that, but I get better services. So this is also for the European digital market and all those developments. It is too much focused on how much we can save because, you know, public finances are such a big mythology around Europe. Public funding has to be low. Let's save. But of course, rather than that, we should actually think, what do we do with these new services? How do we rethink our services? Welfare state, health services, schools, education. How do we actually rethink that from the digital standpoint? And I think there is way too little focus on that. And you know, now you have, for instance, in London, yes, London City withdrew the license from Uber. But you know, what is the next step? I mean, how do we actually deal with this kind of sharing economy giants that are so enormously important and are sort of really revolutionizing services? What do we do in terms of public services? Yes, we go for self-driving cars, but this just makes old system more efficient, but doesn't really rethink the services as transportation in the city. So I think in these aspects, we again see that European Union as such, if you will, is very poor in being pulled and dynamic and actually experimenting as well. So we rather err on the side of caution, stability, but I think we have too much of that, and we should really try to be more proactive and also more courageous, I think, in terms of finding new ways of using the digital advantages that we have. Thanks.
Thank you, Rainer. Well, future is ours if we make it so. So we want jobs, we want prosperity, and we want peace. I'm going to step outside, except that give you the word, fine people, start the discussion. Who wants to go first? In the back, please.
Tõnu Palm from Luminor Bank. You pointed out quite an interesting topic in a sense which is worth getting your view on, namely that we have been discussing more euro like a closed entity, but in a sense we are in global competition vis-a-vis Asia and other economic parts. And if you look on the Greece case, then obviously the welfare state can't be built just by borrowing and spending, in a sense that if you look on the euro aggregate, the higher the living standard, the more globally we should be competitive, each of the countries individually. So if we distribute from surplus countries to the deficit countries, it will not make us too much globally more competitive. So I would more like to hear that how we are going to actually increase the current account surpluses for each individual countries, what we should do. And then we have a bigger cake to share, and we can have a higher welfare state, also income convergence between member states. But we should really have in mind that Asia is coming very strong in R&D investments, in competitiveness. So I would like to hear more. What are the key bullet points for actually getting more euro total surplus on current account?
Who wants to go first? Guntram?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Perhaps let me sort of react to that question as well as to some of what has been said on the panel. So So I think that your question was, don't we all need to adjust to the upside, right? So we all need to become like Sweden or like Estonia, and then things are better because we will have a larger current account surplus to the rest of the world. So I think that was sort of the gist of your question, and. I think at the end of the day, what you want is upward adjustment in the quality of institutions, in innovation capacity, in productivity, but you want still to have balance in terms of the current account, because a large current account surplus eventually means that you essentially save much more than you invest. I mean, that's just an accounting identity, and so why would our continent, as a large economy, be a net saver to the rest of the world? I mean, I think there's no real logic for this. A small saver, perhaps, because we need to save, I guess, in aging societies somewhat for the future. So I would think a small net saving for the Eurozone would be appropriate, but a large one, especially the one of Germany of 8% of GDP, makes basically no sense. So I think what you need is adjustment, and then the question is, how do you get the adjustment? And there, let me just echo what I said. I think we need a symmetric adjustment. So we don't need just Italy to do wage moderation. We need wages to grow in Germany. And then the question is, how do you get wages grow in Germany? Well, I mean, I don't believe that there is sort of a magic mechanism where you say, oh, please now wages increase. I think it is a question of structures of the economy, and there I would very much emphasize the importance of capital intensity, capital investment. Capital investment in Germany has been dreadful in the last 10 years, both public as well private. So let's think about an agenda that will trigger more investment in Germany. Let's think about an agenda that will increase productivity, that will open new sectors so that new investments will actually happen because there's new opportunities in Germany. And that will drive an agenda where Germany will grow, have higher productivity growth, and have higher wage growth, and have higher nominal growth. And that will help the rest of the Eurozone. And so I think this is really the agenda we need to be discussing. And my gut feeling is that a Jamaica coalition in Germany will do actually more on this front in terms of both public investment as well as liberalization, as well as digitalization and so on, than the last government had done. Perhaps let me make one comment on what has been said on the panel, because the panel was very much on sort of this 2009 to 13 crisis, which I didn't discuss much, but which of course was due to major policy failures. Let me just add that I would perhaps debate a bit the statement by Martin that it's just basically mistakes. I think the mistakes were also rooted in a wrong architecture. So it seems to me that the fact that we did not have an ESM, the fact that we did not have an OMT program, I mean, these were major policy institutions that were invented in the course of the crisis, and rightly so, arguably too late, and I agree, we should have, I mean, if we had had the OMT program in 2010, I think the pain on Italy and Greece would certainly have been lower than what it turned out to be. But I think it is rooted, the fact that we didn't have these things is rooted in the fact that these institutions didn't exist and they were not foreseen, at least not sort of in the front page of the Maastricht Treaty. I mean, they were developed and designed under very heavy pressure, under lots of political controversy, and showed the immature nature of this monetary union. And that's why it's so important to think about what is next in terms of finishing the architecture of the monetary union. And it seems to me the most important thing is really to preserve the ESM and the OMT as it is, and then add, and there I agree with George, actually add and improve what we have done on financial integration, which is basically finishing the banking union, for which I think there is intellectual openness across the European Union, as well as finishing the capital markets union. Thank you.
I just want to follow up very quickly, both on the question and some of the things that were mentioned. I really think we need to get away from being obsessed by this concept of competitiveness. So when you worry about competition from Asia, which countries are you worried about? You're not worried about Japan. They're kind of like us. We're worried about China, maybe India. What do those are poor countries, okay? Those are poor countries. They have low living standards, and what they have is cheap labor, still. That is the main distinguishing advantage they have, if you want to call it an advantage. And we should never think that a European country should try to compete with, let's say, China on that basis. That's not what we should do. We should get out, countries should get out of kind of low-wage, intensive types of activities and leave that to countries with low wages, and instead not focus so much on competitiveness. I mean, I'm not trying to be sort of semantic here. I know what you're getting at, but I think the word it kind of leads us astray. We should focus on productivity. We should be more productive, and the more productive you are, the higher living standards you have. That's basic. That's a sort of basic economic fact, that your living standards depend on your productivity, a bit regardless of what other countries do. How do you get productivity? Well, of course, as the other speakers have said, one key issue is investment. Investment into productive capital. Europe should do more of it. We should point out that the last year or two, investment has actually picked up pretty strongly after almost a lost decade. So I think the EU as a whole is now a bit above where it was before the crisis in absolute terms. So that's sort of a waste of a decade, but at least it's increasing fast. That's, in fact, partly because of these low interest rates from ECB speculation. We shouldn't forget that. But does that mean the EU level has to invest? Maybe in kind of EU-wide or Eurozone-wide capital projects, energy infrastructure, maybe IT infrastructure, things like that. But most of it has to be done at the national level. So the European role is to be a facilitator and try to encourage rather than make difficult the right investments nationally. So, here's one suggestion. Why not exempt investment spending from the Growth and Stability Pact? Why not exempt tax incentives for private investment spending from the Growth and Stability Pact? Those would be sort of useful measures that don't require any money from the EU budget, although I agree there's plenty of money there, but facilitated at the national level, and above all, be happy that there's a diversity between different European nations. It's because Estonia does things somewhat differently that there's a lot to learn for other countries. That diversity is a real strength. So don't try to make everyone pursue the same policies, but rather let's encourage people to solve similar problems, maybe in slightly different ways, and let's learn from one another.
Thank you. Do we have a next one? Yes, please. Here up front.
My name is Elias Sekandaris from Alpha TV Greece. My question is, the integration process has pros and cons, and the pros is that more of the center, the core, benefits more from the integration process in terms of a larger market and everything. However, you see also that there is a gravitational wave for labor to the core. At this point of the European development, though, you still see something that was considered as a given when nation states were creating the support of the periphery. Now it's still a taboo, and I'm not talking about fiscal transfers, I'm talking even about risk sharing. You mentioned about specific functions that should go from the national to supranational levels, such as the banking union. However, you realize that where it's the difficult ones still remain under the national responsibility. So what would be the most realistic way to bring in a sense of integration with a balanced way? What could be the role of the nations that matter right now in order to create this balanced approach and to create a new conscience of a new supranational organization arising that will be there for the good and the bad. Because so far, and as the peripheral countries have showed, whenever they were in a difficult place, they were required to borrow money. It wasn't solidarity per se. Do you think that is there room for improvement there? I'm asking Mr. Wolff. Thank you.
George.
If I can respond to both questions, which I think are associated. No one wants to redistribute the surpluses of the surplus countries to the deficit countries in order to fund their welfare states or anything like that. The funding base of welfare states needs to remain national revenues and adjustment in pension spending. But what we've been saying is that the Eurozone needs to be able to react more as a single macroeconomy, not for reasons of solidarity, but for reasons of being able to react more effectively to crisis and to make sure that we have better results in the national adjustment efforts that have been made. And not all countries can become Germany in terms of its competitiveness. That would mean rewriting their track of development over the last couple of centuries. But the deficit countries need to become more export-oriented, not just through depressing wages, but through investing in increases in productivity. It is the increases in productivity that should be the focus, and everything that affects the rise of productivity, from infrastructure, skill building, education, R&D, etc., performance of bureaucracies, and the surplus countries need to become more demand-oriented. This is the kind of symmetrical adjustment that we've been talking about. And this is in order not to redistribute resources, not to transfer resources. It is in order to be able to allow the Eurozone to operate more effectively on stabilization. We've heard a lot about, in fact, the paper, the non-paper of the German Finance Ministry talks about a stability union. In fact, we need an insurance union. Insurance union would be the kind of union that shares risk, and by sharing risk, reduces risk. Reduces the negative legacies, the debilitating legacies of painful adjustment that has exclusively relied on internal devaluation. Just to give you an example, in the case of Greece, the investment rate has been cut from 25% to 12%. The investment gap in the countries that have undergone adjustment is huge. The employment rate as a result of extremely steep adjustment is about 50 or 55% of GDP. Now, what this means is that the potential growth rate, the ability of these countries to grow over the foreseeable future has been undermined by the pattern of adjustment that they followed. What could have helped if, for example, in the countries that are undergoing painful adjustment, by doing their reforms, we could also at the same time have investment directed to these economies. For example, by establishing a few European Union institutions, the same way that the US federal government does if there is a crisis in a state that is of an asymmetric nature. More importantly, by adopting elements of a closer financial union in the ways that have been mentioned, and some element of stabilization on the budgetary level, even if we do not have a real fiscal capacity. And one more thing, as you mentioned, I had a brief experience under the two non-political governments of Greece in from the end of 2011, 2012, the technocratic governments. And every day there were reports coming in, tens of reports, speculating on when Greece would exit the euro. That was the time when Greece was implementing the most painful adjustment program ever undertaken in any OECD country. If we look at not what Greece says, but what the OECD Going for Growth report says, the Lisbon Council talking about the magnitude of adjustment. And still, despite the fact that the economy was adjusting, there was all this speculation. And you know why all this speculation was not only the huge challenge of adjustment, which was clearly enormous for the shoulders of any Greek government, but in fact any democratic government, and the inefficiencies in implementation, but it was also the fact that the Eurozone did not do what the ECB did through Mario Draghi in July, promised that it would do whatever it takes to make sure that every country remains in the euro. Every time such a statement was made at a Eurogroup level, there was always a footnote. As long as they do that, under the condition that they do that. And this was exactly the signal that the markets were receiving that the country's participation in the euro is not guaranteed. So we better not bet our money in this country, and that's not only bondholders, it is also longer-term investment. And this is the way you lock an economy that is doing its best to, under very adverse circumstances, to adjust, and has done many, many mistakes in the past. This is the way you lock it in a vicious circle, from which it will be very difficult to exit, and the cost of which, again, the Eurozone will have to bear at some point later, because the inability to service the debt will mean that you will need more bold reprofiling and so forth. So I put this question to you, is this a smart way of handling a crisis? And I think the answer is pretty obvious.
Yeah, well, just about the both questions in a way, and I think we still talk too little about investment or the need to invest, and also I think there is a misconception in a way that yes, some European economies, investment is picking up, there is growth, but if you look what is sort of driving the growth, it's not investment still, but it's actually consumption. So a lot of the economies like UK, for instance, it's consumption-driven growth and consumption that is driven by private debt. So people like you and me taking out mortgages and all that, this is still driving the economy, for instance, in the UK. And I think this is where the European level action is really important, because the European Union, if you look closely, we have actually agreed on all kinds of very, very nice goals, admirable goals, like grand challenges, green economy, to deal with those issues. But then we sort of put bits and pieces, small money, and saying, yes, nation states, you do it because you know how to do it. But of course, this is where I think the European Union, really should step in and say, yes, we have huge, long-term, 10-year, 15-year investment programs into green economy, because nobody else is going to do that. Because small countries like Estonia, or even nation states larger than Estonia, Italy, whatnot, there is not enough incentives for big, or for countries individually to invest. So, but if you do as a large 500 million consumer economy and go all out for green, for instance, you can do something, you can change something, and you can really change the way we live in Europe. But also the same thing about aging societies. I mean, creating new type of services for the elderly and all those things and using that. So I think this is where, yes, you need local nation-state level experimentation and all that, but you also need EU level investment. Investment is just not enough. I mean, I think it hasn't been enough for a long, long period of time, and I think if you don't admit to that, we always gonna sort of nitpick around problems, adjustment here and adjustment there, maybe like the banking union and so. As I said, but you know, what's the problem with the banking union? There's lots of money being pushed. I mean, a country like Estonia, there is no public debt, there is no private bonds to buy. The Estonian central bank goes out and buys every month bonds from somewhere, so they have to choose to buy something. So there is money, but we can't invest. So, I mean, this is absurd structural problem. And this requires a European Union level action, not German, France, whatever action.
So just to reply to the question here, I mean, I guess my first point would be, I'm not sure that I agree with you that the integration of markets leads to centralization of activity, which, if I understood you correctly, was your starting point. I think what we are seeing is that prior to the Eurozone crisis, we've seen a lot of capital flowing to the periphery because of a massive interest rate shock. That capital, in many respects, was not spent productively. I mean, you talked about the Greek public sector, how it was wasted in the Greek public sector. If you take some other countries, take Portugal, a lot was in consumption. In Ireland, a lot was in unsustainable housing. In Spain, a lot in construction also. So I think there was a sort of something happening that was masking, I think, a very different trend. And I think the different trend is that we've been getting more integrated into global and European value chains. And I think what you've seen in the last 10, 15 years, you've seen a lot of investments from the core of the Eurozone, especially Germany, but also France, into Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe still has significantly lower wages while at the same time having comparable productivity levels or, let's say, levels of good governance, or even better levels of good governance than many countries in the south of Europe. So I think we should not forget that that the opening up of the markets to Central and Eastern Europe, I think, did lead to a reorientation of sort of long-term FDI investment across Europe that I think was being felt quite a bit in the south of Europe, and that, in a sense, the euro introduction just sort of put a layer over this that, you know, was hiding this trend. Which brings me to the point on productivity, which I think you emphasized very much, and you know, I think I would agree with this, and I think everybody agrees with this. We need productivity, not wage. We don't need wage reductions. We need increases in productivity. Well, I mean, to be honest, if you look at the hardcore sort of numbers on, let's say, the big indicator numbers like level of corruption, level of good governance, level of PISA school performance, level of investment into R&D, we do actually have a problem, and that problem is to a significant extent a South Europe problem. So I agree with you, we need to bring up the productivity levels, but then let's talk about it and let's really do it. Yeah. And that I think is a very, very important agenda, certainly for the countries in the south. Now then your question was, you know, what do we do, what can we do to sort of, I guess, increase the willingness to support European insurance schemes and European transfer systems and so on. And you know, I think ultimately we will need this, and we need the insurance systems. I don't think we need transfer systems. I think transfer systems will be, I mean, if it becomes a transfer system, I think Belgium and Catalonia should be lessons enough. I mean, I think ultimately if you have a long-term transfer system, it puts huge tension on the political system, and I think it will blow it apart very quickly. But I think I agree that we need an insurance elements, and I think at the end of the day, I think the crux of the matter is that the politics are national and local, and the local resistance to insurance systems in a situation in which people in Berlin, in Germany, in other countries, in the Netherlands, basically think, you know, the south of Italy or Greece have low governance indicators and so on, is going to be very difficult. I think that's I guess my bottom line. And you know, I critique that, and I think we need to increase the stability of the system and do something. But I think there's huge resistance to this.
Martin, short comment.
Yeah,
I still want to get one more question, but
I think the question is a crucial one about who benefits from economic integration, and if the core benefits more than the periphery, you know, why integrate from the periphery's point of view?
Right.
I think we want to distinguish between the single market and the euro.
Yeah.
The single market is about allowing for greater scale, right? And scale means concentration. So I think there's a good case for worrying that the single market actually benefits the core more than the periphery. That doesn't mean that the periphery doesn't benefit, and the periphery, certainly at the beginning of the single market process, was so far behind that, and it's same for the new accession states, I think, so far behind the core that any kind of link was beneficial. But maybe there's a trap somewhere, right, where you can never catch up. That's a worry. It's a worry that's recognized in the fact that we have structural funds, right, that are partly due to compensate for that. The euro, I think, is very different. The euro did affect the periphery very badly in the crisis, largely, I think, again, because of mismanagement. Before the crisis, it was the other way around, right? Growth was lower in Germany than it otherwise would have been because all of these capital exports promoted growth in the periphery. And that included, incidentally, the Baltics, and Guntram has talked about Bulgaria in some of his writings. Not just then euro members, but pegged countries and countries with the capital flows. So that's why I'm skeptical of when people say, you know, German surpluses are a drag on growth. Actually, before the crisis, they were a boost to growth elsewhere. And then you had the crisis that was mismanaged. But I think that was a period, and that period is more or less over. But what does that mean? It means that you don't want to aim for balanced current accounts in the Eurozone. You want the poorer countries to have current account deficits, to import capital. You want the richer countries to export capital, because that's partly a way to address that possible problem with a single market. If all the economic activity and investment is concentrated in the core, you'll get divergence. If core economic actors decide to invest in the periphery, that's what capital flows means, then you will spread some of that productive activity. So I think we need to have as an aim for the Eurozone to return to modest, not as big as before, capital flows, net capital flows from the core to the periphery, and then have good policies to make sure that that capital is invested well, and that it's in a form that can't be pulled back so fast. The problem is more debt than the flow. If you have FDI, if you have equity, or as you did here and in your neighboring countries, if you have a banking system, a foreign banking system that stays in place, you'll have a kind of quick and sharp crisis, and then you move on, and not what you've had in the periphery. So the euro is a solution, actually, if it's well managed, to the possible worry about the single market.
Good. I saw the hand last time. You in the back row? Yes, please. Make it short, and please make the answer short, or if you direct it directly to somebody.
So I appreciate this question is between the end and lunch, so I'll keep it short. I just wanted to make an observation which is really about whether the panel as a whole has been far too sanguine about the dynamics of the Eurozone and of the single market as a whole. Contrary to Martin, I don't think Montesquieu is necessarily the best place to go. And I put it to you that national competition, or competition between national economies, is still a structuring feature of both the Eurozone and single market dynamics. And as far as I understand it, variations in exchange rates have been ways to manage competition between national economies. And if you take that key macro economic adjustment tool away, then you simply will have competition on wages and prices. You will. And we have seen that in the history of the Eurozone. Now, productivity is often wheeled in as a sort of antidote to that kind of competition. But it's also a very difficult thing to pin down, a very difficult thing to identify, especially in terms of strategies to boost productivity. And my question to, I suppose, the panel is, there is a connection, I think, that can be established between productivity and the structure of labor markets. And as you deregulate labor markets, you change the incentives for employers in terms of investing in their staff. Why invest if you can just hire somebody else very easily? So the logic of the single market is to create, I think, eventually very deregulated labor markets where you have much easier transfers of people in and out of national labor markets. That will have a boost, I think, on productivity, but not in the direction that you're suggesting. So what strategies would you suggest for boosting productivity when you have this effect of deregulated labor markets?
We are on borrowed time, so please be brief. Martin, brief.
Yeah, I'll try and be very brief. I think on the devaluation thing, well, are we too sanguine? No. On the devaluation thing, I think you're falling into this neoliberal trap. That's the same as saying, oh, we need to push wages down and then we'll have more export demand and we'll thrive. Devaluation is the same thing. It's selling yourself more cheaply. Right? That's what devaluation is. It means taking less money for the things you export. That's not a sustainable strategy. The reason why it's sometimes thought that it's helped is, I don't think so much because of the price change, but because it's allowed a more stimulative monetary policy when you leave an exchange rate peg. But I challenge you to look in the last 2-3 decades to identify many episodes where you've had a big depreciation or devaluation and you've seen a big pickup in exports, which is supposedly the channel. There might have been a monetary stimulus. But I mean, even in Italy in '92, look at the export, you don't really see a big difference. Look at the UK in 2008 or last year, you also don't see a pickup in exports. Modern economies and the richest economies don't compete on price so much anymore. And if that's going to be your strategy, you will confine yourself to those sectors that are less sophisticated, more price sensitive and less quality and ultimately less value added intensive.
Rainer.
Yeah, I mean, on the wage competition, of course, Germany is the European master in that. I mean, in the very sense, of course, the Gerhard Schröder reforms in early 2000s were really key to wage constraint in Germany over 10 years, actually. And that laid really the foundation for the export miracle that we have now. But of course, what can you do is, I mean, yes, you have to have some sort of insurance schemes around it, but I think the key is actually the new jobs. You have to, and then you have to be able to create them, and this goes mainly over public investment, I'm afraid.
Guntram.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Martin that the nominal exchange rate mechanism is probably overstressed. I mean, so the relevance of this mechanism as an adjustment tool in integrated economies with lots of value chains, I think is being overemphasized. But there is a huge academic debate on this, to be honest, and I don't think that debate is totally conclusive. But I would certainly concur with your point that as our markets get more integrated, competition is becoming more ferocious and is more biting and more painful. And yes, that's why I mentioned the Eastern Europe example. I mean, 20 years ago, the Portuguese worker was not in that kind of direct competition that he is now in with a Polish worker. And yes, that poses a lot of challenges, and I think these challenges have to be addressed. Now, is the solution to go back and so basically close the borders? I mean, I think no. I think that's Trump recipe, and I think Trump will utterly fail with his set of policies.
George. Sorry.
It's okay.
Well, George, having lambasted the internal devaluation, let me just come in full agreement with Martin and
please.
I'll be very brief. Internal devaluation mimics the effects of currency devaluation, and if it is targeted well, it can do better. The gains of currency devaluation are usually eaten away by inflation. Currency devaluation can be very unfair because it favors those who hold hard currency, so it could end up accentuating inequality. So if you implement internal devaluation effectively, and this requires good governance, you can have the same effects. Now, the strategies to boost productivity, the companies have an incentive to boost productivity. It would boost their profitability. Governments have strategies to boost productivity by a smart use of public resources, by R&D spending and skill building and investing in education and training systems. And all these are factors, and by cutting away the red tape, all these are factors that could help governments increase incomes along the way by raising productivity rather than achieve competitiveness by cutting wages.
Okay, now the original question was, is the economy still holding Europe together? I'm going to rephrase it. My last question is, will the economy hold Europe together? And this is where we check if scholars and economists can be brief. You can only say yes, no, or maybe. Martin?
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe.
Maybe. George?
There's no way of going back, yes.
Thank you, panelists.
He
Thank
said
you, audience. Let's have lunch.
Unfair.
Learn the hard lessons.